We simply cannot allow people to pour into the United States undetected, undocumented, unchecked.
And complete the dang fence.
This bill that we will sign today is not a revolutionary bill.
Cast down your bucket where you are.
We come from France.
And I am, adamantly against illegal immigrants.
They're coming in by the thousands, just unbelievable.
A wall is an immorality.
Who are you rooting for?
Those masters of the universe are at it again.
You maniac! You blew it up!
Welcome to Parsing Immigration Policy, the podcast of the Center for Immigration Studies. This is Mark Krikorian, Executive Director of the Center. Hope everybody had a good Thanksgiving. We take a hiatus over Thanksgiving to give our hard-working producer, Brian Griffith, a break. But we are back now, and joining us again is Andrew Arthur, who, if you listen to the podcast, you've heard a number of times. And what I wanted to talk about again is this issue of deportation. We've dealt with various aspects of it, but he had a piece recently called Mass Deportation is just another term for immigration normalcy. In other words, it's kind of self-explanatory. We'll have a link to the piece. But I thought it was worth talking about looking at also what the fiscal year 2024 final numbers were and what it means that the numbers are down at the border, but more importantly, come January 20th, when the new administration takes over, what is mass deportation actually going to mean? So we're going to talk about a bunch of the issues relating to illegal immigration. We've talked about them before. We're going to talk about them again, but this is an essential issue in the politics of this issue of immigration coming up, especially with the new administration taking over. And so I thought it was worth having Art coming in and talking about some of these issues again. So Art, thanks for joining us. And if we could just quickly, this is not specifically on deportation. This is obviously at the number of people at the border. But what does it mean that the numbers are down somewhat for fiscal year 2024, but are still much higher than prior years, right?
Yeah, so, it's actually very interesting, Mark, and thank you for having me on today to talk about this. Because if you, read most of the media or you listen to, experts or people who are talking about the border, they're going to tell you that the border, the southwest border, is a whole lot more under control at the end of the Biden administration than it was before. And just to put all of this into context, in FY 2024, Border Patrol agents at the southwest border apprehended just over 1.53 million illegal entrants. Now, the biggest bunch of those people came earlier in the year, particularly in December of 2023, which is part of FY 2024, but we still saw significant numbers of people apprehended at the southwest border. And what, most of the media and many of these experts will tell you is, well, we're doing a whole lot better now than we were in FY 2023, when Border Patrol apprehended about 2.045 million people at the southwest border, which was a major improvement over FY 2022, when apprehensions ran at more than 2.2 million. So, at first blush, it looks like the border is, a lot more secure at the end of the Biden-Harris administration, certainly than it was in the middle of that administration. But there's a key aspect of this that most people miss, and that is that up until May 11th, 2023, Border Patrol agents had the ability to expel people who had entered illegally under Title 42. Title 42, of course, is the public health provision of the U.S. Code, but it's come to mean the series of orders that were issued by the Centers for Disease Control directing the expulsion of all aliens who entered the United States illegally, and all those at the ports of entry didn't have proper documents in order to minimize the introduction and spread of the novel coronavirus COVID-19. So up until May 11, 2023, which was in FY 2023, Border Patrol agents and CBP officers at the ports had the ability to expel migrants. And, we saw diminishing returns from that under the Biden administration as the Mexican government increasingly refused to take third country nationals back. They've always been willing to take back Mexican nationals. They have to under international law. And they even were willing to take back nationals of the Northern Triangle countries of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. But, increasingly, the Mexican government refused to take back people who we attempted to expel under Title 42. So we definitely saw diminishing returns. Now, anybody who wasn't expelled under Title 42 had to be processed for removal proceedings under the Immigration and Nationality Act, which is Title 8. And as Title 42 began to expire, Karine Jean-Pierre, the White House press secretary in particular, would talk about this other power, Title 8, which really just refers to the INA, the Immigration and Nationality Act. So let's take a look at how the Title 8 numbers, the number of people who are apprehended at the border and processed under Title 8, what those numbers looked like at the border, because, of course, that excludes all those people we expelled under Title 42. Well, in FY 2022, there were 1.152 million illegal entrants who were processed under Title 8. By FY 2023, the year in which Title 42 ended, that jumped up to nearly 1.5 million. It was 1.496 million. In FY 2024, and this is the part that most people miss, it actually increased again to 1.53 million. So when you're talking about migrants who were apprehended at the border, the reason that, big cities like New York and Philadelphia, Chicago, and Denver have migrant problems isn't because of the number of people that Border Patrol agents apprehended. It's the number of those people who were released into the United States. And we know that about 88.5% or more of the people who were encountered at the southwest border actually were released into the United States. So when you're simply looking at those apprehensions, they've increased year after year under the Biden-Harris administration. It was actually 1.659 million apprehensions at the southwest border in FY 2021, but only 619,000 Title 8 cases. So that's really sort of the dirty secret of this. Now, the other dirty secret of this is that the Biden-Harris administration launched what they called lawful pathways, which was a misnomer for any number of reasons. But there were two main lawful pathways that the Biden-Harris administration introduced. The first one, of course, was CHNV parole for nationals of Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. And under that program, up to 30,000 nationals of those four countries were allowed to fly directly into the United States every month beginning in January of 2023. The other one is what I call the CBP-1 app interview scheme, under which migrants who would otherwise have entered illegally are allowed to use the CBP-1 app available on Apple or in the Google Store to make an appointment at a port of entry. And we know that about 97.5% of all the aliens who used the app and made appointments were actually released into the United States. So there were 172,000 encounters at the southwest border ports of entry in FY 2022, and that was a little bit higher than traditional numbers, but it wasn't that out of whack. By FY 2023, after these two lawful pathways went into effect, that jumped up to 430,000. 415,000 of those people were processed under Title 8. By 2024, it was up to 604,000. Now, again, most of those people are going to be released into the United States. They're going to head to those cities. They're going to, incur fiscal costs that taxpayers are going to have to pay for. So at the end of the Biden-Harris administration, from a perspective of town managers or, big city mayors, the migrant issue really hasn't gotten any better. In fact, it's worse than it was at the beginning. So that's really the most important thing to understand as we turn to the second iteration of the Trump administration.
So, and now along those lines, they've let all these people in. And so this is the reason that President Trump, or former president and soon to be again President Trump, made this issue of large-scale mass deportations such a key issue in his message, and has been, the polling, even after the election, shows continued, widespread support for literally when they say mass deportations. They actually use those terms, which, in the past was considered kind of not taboo, but sort of going too far, was considered too harsh. And yet, when pollsters use that actual terminology, they still get very high levels of support. So we've talked about this some, and so the news has as well, but it's worth addressing again. What does mass deportation actually mean? And is that really going to be all that different from what happened in previous administrations, but not under this administration? In other words, as you said in this blog post, mass deportation, as it's being described by the incoming border czar, Tom Homan, really isn't an outlier. It's what we've had the past 4 years, which is an outlier.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's crucial to, understand a couple of things. First, the Immigration and Nationality Act is written in mandatory terms. Congress, very specifically directed the executive branch to do certain things, that it shall, place into removal proceedings individuals who are inadmissible to the United States, that it shall remove individuals who are ordered removed from the United States. But unfortunately, over the past 4 years of the Biden-Harris administration, that's really been a directive that's been honored in the breach. And that's, part of a couple of factors. The first factor is a series of orders that were issued by higher ups in DHS, restricting the ability of immigration officers to go out, pick up, detain, prosecute, and remove aliens in the United States. The first one of those was actually issued by David Pekoski, who was acting DHS secretary minutes after the 2021 inauguration. And that was followed up by one by Tay Johnson, who is the acting ICE director. But the most crucial one was issued in September of 2021 by DHS Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas, Guidelines for Immigration Enforcement. And what those guidelines did was it required ICE officers and ICE attorneys to consider various aggravating and mitigating factors before they take enforcement action. Again, investigation, apprehension, detention, prosecution, and removal. And among those mitigating factors were the alien's youth or old age, whether the alien had any family members who worked for the federal government, and incredibly, whether the alien had some sort of mental condition that prompted the alien toward criminality. Now, the INA is very clear that every criminal alien, every alien who is removable on criminal grounds, is supposed to be taken into custody, detained until they're either, found to be eligible for some waiver that would allow them to stay, or alternatively before they're removed. So the Biden-Harris restrictions actually short-circuited that entire process at the beginning by taking a huge number of aliens off of the table, which is why right now there are about 1.4 million aliens who are under final orders of removal who haven't been removed from the United States. There are hundreds of thousands of criminal aliens who are subject to removal who haven't even been put into removal proceedings. Now, that was different from prior administrations in a number of ways. One, no prior administration ever asked you to consider, mitigating factors before you took enforcement action. If the alien's removable, you place them into removal proceedings. But various administrations, the Obama administration and the Trump administration, both prioritized certain cases for removal. Of course, the top priority for both Obama and Trump were aliens who pose a national security risk to the United States. Unfortunately, we've discovered that some of those aliens encountered at the border posed a national security risk because they were on the terror watch list and were, inadvertently released into the United States. And that's a subject for a different day. But the second priority for all of these prior administrations was those criminal aliens. Any alien who was removable on criminal grounds was a priority to be taken into custody and, prosecuted and removed. So that was really the big delta. And when you talk about mass deportation, what you're talking about is removing that population of criminal aliens and removing that population, 1.4 million aliens who are under final orders of removal. That, again, those people were allowed to remain in the United States in clear abrogation of the Immigration and Nationality Act. But, that's really when you talk about, mass deportation. In fact, sometimes Trump will even say mass deportation of criminal aliens. You're really talking about the highest profile targets, the people under final orders of removal and criminals.
The interesting thing I think people are wondering about is these guidelines that you talked about that were issued, basically instructions to ICE staff by Biden's DHS to, not sort of hands off, but it kind of handcuffed, ICE officials. So let's say those guidelines are all just changed and canceled at 12:01 on January 20th. And they're presumably going to be significantly changed very quickly, if not at 12:01. Then what? In other words, so now ICE officers can do their thing, basically, and the priorities will still be there, presumably, because if with limited resources, you still have to prioritize. They're going to go after, and this is something Tom Homan has said, national security threats, criminals, as you mentioned, people who've had their day in court, been ordered removed, been ordered deported, but basically just ignored that and blew it off and, sort of are in the wind. So what exactly is that going to mean? How are they really going to be able to increase the number of those kind of people that they find and remove? Or is just changing the guidelines a kind of notional thing? In other words, it's aspirational, but how are they going to meet that aspiration?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. It's one that I actually get a lot. Some of those people, we know exactly where they are. We can, go out, take them into custody, and we can put them in detention. Now, right now, detention space is limited, but there are plenty of options that are available to the incoming Trump administration for detention. Of course, there are still detention beds that, ICE has or that it contracts for. Another option, one that I've talked about a lot, county jails. When I was an immigration judge at the York County Prison in York, Pennsylvania, not an immigration hotspot, but it was a place that would rent out empty beds to DHS to hold aliens while they were going through removal proceedings. And actually, aliens, when they're in removal proceedings, that's a quick process. It could take anywhere between 2 weeks and about a month and a half to actually physically remove, finish those cases and either release them or remove them.
I don't want to interrupt your train of thought, but keep your train of thought that the amount of time that you explained there is for people who are not claiming asylum, right? People who are...
No, that includes...
Oh, really?
That includes people who are claiming asylum. One of the things that we see in non-detained cases is that if you're a respondent in immigration court, you have no interest in getting to the end of your case unless you have the most meritorious asylum claim you can imagine.
Sure.
If you don't have a truly meritorious asylum claim, every continuance that you request simply adds to the time that you're in the United States, gives you more time to live here and gives you more time to build up equity.
Whereas if you're locked up, it's not, that benefit does not exist.
Exactly. Yeah. You want to get that done as quickly as possible. And a lot of people who have non-meritorious, claims or no claims at all, they're simply going to give up and they're going to say, I'll take voluntary departure. I'll take an order of removal. I just want to get out of custody.
So your detention capacity was county jails. So what are the other options to hold people that they actually end up grabbing up and are trying to remove?
Yeah. So, one option that was, suggested by the first Trump administration, but actively used by the Obama administration are military bases. Mm-hmm. In 2014, we saw a huge influx of family migrants and also unaccompanied alien children. And this put the Obama administration in a fix because there were only so many beds that they could put kids into. For that reason, the Obama administration actually opened up military bases, Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio, Fort Sill in Lawton, Oklahoma, which is the world's largest artillery range also, and Naval Base Ventura County in California to place unaccompanied alien children in. So, you'll hear people say, oh my God, it's awful if Trump were to put, illegal migrants into military bases. Keep in mind, Obama actually put kids on those bases, and they were perfectly fine with the appropriate accommodations. So, that definitely is a force multiplier. When you talk about the border, we have a number of military, installations that line the border that could be, converted to that use. So, military housing is another one. So you've got them. Then you have to actually, put them through removal proceedings. So ones who are under final orders, we don't have to worry about because they're already under final order. The rest of them, we can use video teleconferencing, bring in judges from around the country to actually hear their cases while they're detained. So, that is an option. We need more immigration judges. We probably need about 250 to 500 more. We have about 730 now. But that definitely is something that the administration can use to expedite people out of the United States. So then the question becomes how you actually get them out of the United States. And, that's probably the simplest issue to deal with. Now, ICE does have some airplanes or charter flights at its disposal that it can use, but you don't really need those because most major cities have something called an international airport. And when I was a young trial attorney, we never thought that there was INS Air that was going to take people home. We thought that you were going to take people down to San Francisco International Airport, wait with them at the transit lounge, put them on the plane, wait till the plane left, and then the officers could walk away.
But can you do that with criminal aliens? That's if the priority of getting rid of criminals is such a big deal as it should be, especially because this administration, under the current administration, criminal deportations declined so radically. This is something our colleague John Feary has crunched the numbers on, and it was something like a 2/3 decline. If you're going to ramp up those first, can you really put, rapists who finished their sentences on commercial flights? I mean, maybe you can, but how does that kind of thing work?
Sure. I mean, again, if it's, somebody who is extremely dangerous, you can have them escorted by an ICRO officer to their destination. But, most of those people, behave anyway. But if you think about it, if you fly a lot, you're on a plane with a lot of people who have criminal convictions already. And they obey the rules when they are on, that plane. So, and, again, there are definitely a large number of particularly, serious criminals, but there are a lot of people who are criminals who have nonviolent offenses. And even, some people who have, simple assault offenses, you can put them on a plane and send them home.
Right.
So, yeah, so long as you notify the airline that that's what you're going to do, you can take care of it that way. It's not an insurmountable problem.
And one of the problems that is going to come up in deporting a lot of these people is the country they come from. If they're coming from Mexico, there's no problem. If they're coming from most Central American countries, probably not big problem. But a large number of especially the problematic people, the ones who've gotten the news attention anyway, are Venezuelan. The people involved with the Tren de Aragua gang, that sort of thing. And the programs that you referred to, the supposed lawful pathways that are illegal, letting illegal immigrants schedule their arrival to the United States, there's a lot of Venezuelans, several 100,000, who have come in through that, as well as other Venezuelans who just showed up at the border and were let go. What do we do with those people? Because Venezuela is, not likely to be inclined to cooperate with us. So what do we do specifically with the large number of Venezuelans we want to get rid of?
So, yeah, consular processing in Caracas has actually been suspended due to, our refusal to recognize the fake re-election of President Nicolas Maduro. But Venezuelans actually apply for visas at other consular posts, primarily Bogota, Colombia. So, anybody that comes in with a Venezuelan passport, we can simply deny them a visa as a matter of course.
And this denial of visas is in the Immigration and Nationality Act, right? In other words, the power to do that.
It's specifically there. And again, as I said, this was used by the Bush administration, used by the Obama administration, and used by the Trump administration. So,
right.
This isn't some sort of mystical power. It's something that Congress put into the law back in 1996. Now, the other thing, and this one, is probably as effective, if not more effective, is we buy Venezuelan oil.
Right.
So if Venezuela refuses to give us travel documents for their nationals, if they refuse to take their nationals back, we could just tell them we're going to stop buying their oil. And we're going to put, heavy sanctions on any product that comes from Venezuela to the United States. That economic power is really, really big, especially in an economy like Venezuela's that's been on the ropes for the last 10 years.
And it seems like the kind of flip side is also possible. In other words, that's the stick. But, if the Trump administration decides that getting Venezuela to take its own citizens back is important enough, they potentially could offer sweeteners. In other words, like we can end certain parts of sanctions against Venezuela if they agree to X, Y, and Z. In other words, it seems to me this is an area where diplomacy can work, both the carrot and the stick. And we don't have super great relations with Cuba, but they take significant numbers of their own people back if necessary as well. And so I think the point is, it's going to be a problem to send Venezuelans back, or it's a challenge, but it's not an insuperable challenge. It's not like there's no way to deal with this.
Yeah, and it's important to note the fact that the election of Donald Trump has really sort of reset U.S. relations with the entire world. Right. So, in much the same way that we've seen Justin Trudeau go down to Mar-a-Lago, don't be surprised if the Venezuelan government doesn't make entreaties to, start with a fresh slate with Washington, D.C., now that there is a new president and one who is actually serious about diplomatic relations enforcing the law in U.S. trade.
Right. The last thing I wanted to ask about, and you sort of alluded to it a little bit on this, the issue of how are we going to ramp up deportations is, well, two things. First of all, you mentioned using military bases for housing. It seems to me that's the main contribution when the President Trump talks about, using the Army. It's not like the 82nd Airborne is going to be flying into alien communities, parachuting in and rounding people up. It's mainly a logistical issue, and the Army does logistics. That's what our successful militaries do. Is that, or am I misunderstanding that?
No, and this is one of those things that a lot of people just, sort of miscomprehend. When it comes to the use of the military, in reality, and, I should have started all of this with saying the first thing that Trump needs to do is secure the border. Before you start bailing the boat of migrants who are here illegally, you need to secure the border. And the military, can play a key role and does play a key role in that. Ever since 2006, when President George W. Bush had Operation Jumpstart, military assets, National Guard, have been sent to the southwest border to provide logistical assistance. They basically do line watch, they do warehousing, they do supplemental duties. They don't actually, arrest anybody, but they're certainly available to do those ancillary duties that will free up Border Patrol agents. The other key role that the military can play is that the president can declare a border emergency and can use those military assets to erect infrastructure at the southwest border. When we talk about the border wall system, they can put up the fencing, they can turn on the lights, they can turn on the cameras, they can run the fiber optic cable. And that actually is good training for our engineering brigades because, they actually get the experience of building something. And, President Trump used that in 2019. He declared a border emergency and sent military assets to the border to actually put those impediments in place. So, yeah, when you're talking about the 1st Marine Battalion going door to door in, Chicago, that's probably not going to happen. But when you talk about National Guard units being sent to the border to, take some of that pressure off of Border Patrol by doing all of those ancillary, activities, they're perfectly, available to do that. They've done it before, and they're doing it right now.
Yeah, so the military has a role both in helping stop new people from coming in, but also in helping the, removal of people who are already here. The last thing we're bumping up against time. The last thing I wanted to ask about was the family detention and family removals issues, because lots of the illegal aliens, even the criminals, and certainly probably even a larger share of the people with final orders of deportation who ignored them, basically fugitives, are going to have kids. Some of the kids will be immigrants themselves, but many, if not most, are going to be U.S.-born kids, depending on how long they've been here. Obviously, there's a bunch of elements in the law. I don't want to go over all of them that make it hard to detain people with children for a long time. But, how do we deal with that challenge, since it's going to come up even relatively soon, even if you're just dealing with criminals and people with, fugitives who've ignored their deportation orders?
Look, this has always been an issue. It's been an issue that's, been around for decades. If you are in the United States, and your kid is here and your kid is removable and you're removable, we send you what we call a bag and baggage letter. We tell you to report. We have your travel documents and your tickets, and we send you to depart foreign, as we say in the practice. Now,
Right.
If you are somebody who has a United States citizen child, that's sort of a challenge, but there is a form of relief called cancellation of removal for people who have immediate relatives, specifically young children, who are in the United States. If you didn't apply for cancellation of removal or you were denied, then it's really your choice. You decide what you want to do. Many people will bring their children with them. They'll take them back home. They'll raise them in the home country. They will still be United States citizens. And, they can come back whenever they want. Or alternatively, they can place them with a family member here. But, the idea that simply having a child is a get out of jail free card, is fallacious, because Congress has specifically considered the issue and has decided that only those children who are going to be subject to exceptional and extremely unusual hardship will count as an equity for that parent who's facing removal. Otherwise, Congress has said it's up to the parents to make the accommodations for the kids. Congress can change that law anytime they want. And, depending, maybe they will. But the law is clear as to what's supposed to happen in that situation.
Yeah, the basic point here is that having a kid doesn't mean you get to stay. There's always this use of the term of anchor babies, and I try not to use it. It does have a certain logic to it in some sense, but having a kid here does not create any right to stay. And it doesn't even create a practical reason, except in extreme circumstances, that somebody should stay, because you can always take the kid with you, as you pointed out. And in fact, that happens all the time. Or if you have a sister here or an older brother of the child who's has legal status, kid can stay with them, but it's up to you. And if you separate your family in the process of being deported, say the adults are deported, but the kid stays, you're the one choosing to separate the family. You don't have to do that. This is something Tom Homan was asked about by 60 Minutes, and he said the children can, and in my opinion, personally, should stay with their parents and go back home.
Yeah, and that gets to a bigger issue very briefly, Mark. This is just one of those problems that you create when you don't enforce the law. When you don't enforce the law and you allow people to remain indefinitely, they build up equities, and those make hard cases. But, that's why, rather than opening the border, rather than, dropping 700,000 people from removal proceedings that they're in, you enforce the law. And that way you don't have to face those challenges, and you don't have to deal with the United States citizen who's probably going to be living in a foreign country for a number of years.
Right. Well, thanks, Art. We're going to end it there, but I think this was a useful discussion about what are some of the challenges that the Trump administration is going to face, and really, in a sense, any administration that is interested in enforcing the law, in removing a large number of people. And the reason the incoming Trump administration is going to face extra problems is not that they're different in kind necessarily, but the challenges they face are so much larger because the Biden administration, as you pointed out, basically just refused to enforce the law, and in doing that created bigger problems. So in a sense, it's always easier to mess something up than it is to come in and fix it subsequently. But the Trump administration has committed to fixing it, and as we pointed out here, has the tools and abilities to actually fix the disaster that the current administration has created by refusing to enforce the law. Anyway, thanks for coming in, and we'll obviously going to have you back to talk about this and other issues in the future.
Thank you so much for having me.
And finally, I just wanted to touch on an issue that we'll probably do a whole show on at some point, but it's something that people don't really think about, and that is work permits. Now, this sounds kind of boring and dry, who cares? But the fact is that there are certain visa categories where a work permit is part of the deal. Work visas, that kind of thing. In other words, Congress has provided in the law that certain kinds of visas, the people who get them, when they come here, get to have a work permit. The problem is that the executive branch over a number of administrations has basically concocted out of almost nothing the authorization to give work permits to anyone they feel like. Technically, these are called Employment Authorization Documents, EADs, and it's just a federal government photo ID, but it says you're allowed to work. And you can get a Social Security number. You have to have one in order to work. And the problem is that successive administrations have just given them out to people who have no statutory right to work in the United States, essentially, making an end run around Congress's limits. And we have a blog post on this week by John Miano, who's a fellow with the center. It's titled, Executive Branch Has Created Its Own Separate Immigration System. And he touches on this issue of work authorization, because if you're an illegal immigrant of whatever kind, or you're somehow or another let into you're paroled, for instance, or whatever your status is, and the executive gives you, the Homeland Security gives you a work permit, you basically have everything you need to be legally in the United States and to be able to support yourself. Because, like I said, you get with a work permit, you get a Social Security number too, and you can then get a driver's license and what have you. And so what we've seen here is successive administrations, essentially, as John points out in his blog post, using work permits as a way of creating their own parallel, basically, bootstrapped immigration system out of nothing. And there's a lot of categories like this. One of the things that John talks about is the entrepreneur rule, where supposed entrepreneurs can be paroled in and given work permits. It's not clear why anybody would, do that. It's not a particularly secure status, but the point is it's the kind of thing, and it's not just that one status, that executive branch officials have used to basically ignore Congress's rules. This is something that's got to get dealt with, and this is something that has to be dealt with explicitly in statute. In other words, Congress would have to pass legislation saying no one is allowed to be granted work authorization unless it's specifically related to the visa status they have received under the law. And interestingly enough, great minds think alike, because the Heritage Foundation released a report with 5 principles for immigration law going forward, and then various bullet points under them. And one of them specifically was this issue that, as they put it, quote, Congress, not the administrative state, should determine whether temporary aliens may work in the U.S. Because obviously, if you're a permanent resident, a green card holder, that's being able to work is part of the deal. That's the whole point, really, of it. But not for a lot of other statuses. And so this is something that Congress is going to be dealing with, and that I think administrations, executive offices in the future are going to be dealing with, is this issue of who gets to decide who's allowed to work in the United States. Because if that power isn't exclusively in the hands of Congress, as it should be, then you can have repeats in the future of what the Biden administration has done, which is basically freelance a whole separate immigration system that's not really connected to anything passed by Congress. And that's no way to run a railroad. Anyway, that's it for this week's episode of Parsing Immigration Policy. If you have any comments, questions, suggestions for future shows, anything, feel free to just email us at center@cis.org. Thanks for listening. Thanks to our producer, Brian Griffith. And I encourage you to tune in next week.